Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about FDR and the New Deal. In the last lecture, we looked at the beginning of the Great Depression and how Herbert Hoover attempted to tackle it. So now we're going to see how FDR attempted to deal with this problem, and his program for dealing with the Great Depression is called the New Deal. Now, FDR was born in Hyde Park, New York, in January of 1882. His parents were James Roosevelt and Sarah Delano Roosevelt. FDR grew up in a world of privilege and wealth. His family had house servants. They took regular vacations to Europe. He was an only child, and he often had difficulty relating to others around him. FDR went to the best schools. He went to Groton, kind of a prep school for young men. He went to Harvard and later Columbia. FDR married his distant cousin Eleanor Roosevelt in 1905. They eventually have 6 children over a 10-year period. And Eleanor would be kind of instrumental in helping FDR accomplish what he did throughout his life. In 1910, FDR is asked to run for New York State Senate in a heavily Republican district, Dutchess County. No Democrat had been elected there in 32 years. Despite these overwhelming odds, FDR wins with the help of a kind of rough and tumble journalist named Louis Howe. As a state senator, he battles the Democrat Party bosses in New York State. And in 1913, just prior to the outbreak of World War I, Woodrow Wilson offers him a job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to Josephus Daniels. FDR wanted to be president, and he kind of wanted to take the route his cousin Teddy had taken. Teddy was a state representative in New York. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, later Governor of New York. So FDR kind of wants to follow in the paths of, in the footsteps of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, while serving as Assistant Secretary, FDR learned how to deal with Congress, deal with bureaucracies, deal with the Navy, and with businessmen. So he learns a lot of important lessons. It's during this time in Washington that he also begins to have an affair with a woman named Lucy Mercer. This was his wife's social secretary. Eleanor finds a batch of love letters after FDR returns from a visit to the front in 1918 in France. The two contemplate divorce. Apparently they were going to get one, but FDR's mother, Sarah, threatens to cut off his money if he divorces his wife. FDR was kind of a mama's boy. His mother, Sarah, controlled his money up until the day she died. So after thinking things over for a little while and weighing the loss of the financial support and his political career, FDR decides not to get a divorce. He and Eleanor remain married, although the marriage is more for appearances. They don't have a loving marriage from this point on. It's basically a marriage of convenience to kind of help his political career. Now, in 1920, after World War I is over, FDR is picked to run on the presidential ticket. He's slotted as the vice president to run as James Cox's running mate. FDR campaigns vigorously, but as we saw earlier, 1920 is a huge landslide year for Republicans. And FDR is about to experience something that will kind of knock him out of the political arena for almost the next decade. In August 1921, so after he's defeated in the presidential election as the vice presidential candidate, FDR visits a Boy Scout camp, and he contracts a virus. Later at Campobello, it was kind of a retreat that his family would go to. It's an island off of Maine. He gets sick, and he soon finds out he can't walk. He gets diagnosed with infantile paralysis, polio. Many people believe that FDR's career is over. His mother, Sarah, wants him to come home to Hyde Park and basically live as an invalid. She wants him just to work on his stamp collection and kind of forget about politics. But Eleanor refuses to let this happen. Eleanor kind of stands up to her mother-in-law, Sarah, and says, I want, Franklin to continue working. I want him to stay in politics. So FDR battles with depression. He uses denial to deal with his condition. But he does work through his illness with the hope that he will someday walk again. He exercises a lot. He tries all the latest treatments, things like sun lamps, electric belts, massages, pulley systems that help him exercise. He even has contraptions that hang him from the ceiling upside down to try to help him regain his muscle strength. FDR does eventually learn how to walk with a cane and the assistance of someone, what he would do is he would have leg braces on, and he would grab onto somebody's arm, somebody that was strong. It was usually one of his sons, and he would kind of twist his hips sideways. I've got a short little video clip here of you that you can watch that kind of shows him walking this way. So it kind of appears that he's walking, but he's actually crippled. So you can watch that here. Okay, so FDR ends up buying a boat called the Lirocco. He spends time in Florida during the 1920s, just kind of checks out of the national stage, out of politics. His wife goes around the country giving speeches. She works in the women's kind of division of the Democrat Party. She keeps his name alive. FDR eventually goes to Warm Springs, Georgia. They have some healing waters there. Some of these hot springs bubble up out of the ground. He ends up buying a retreat center where he helps other polio victims. Many people believe that FDR's experience with polio helped him understand what suffering was and kind of prepared him for his role as president during the Great Depression. There's a great observation in Freedom from Fear. David M. Kennedy writes, quote, "Many of Roosevelt's acquaintances also believe that his grim companionship with paralysis gave to this shallow, supercilious youth the precious gift of a purposeful manhood." And I got a little clip here that kind of shows him swimming at Warm Springs and kind of playing water polo with other polio victims, most of them children. So you can watch that little clip here. Okay, so in 1928, FDR makes his political comeback. He goes to the Democrat National Convention in Houston. He nominates Al Smith for the presidency, but Al Smith would lose in a landslide to Hoover in 1928. But everyone knows that this guy, FDR, who was an up-and-coming star and then was struck with polio, everyone knows he's back. FDR runs for governor in New York in 1928, and he wins. He will win re-election in 1930. So as Hoover is struggling with the Great Depression, FDR is governor, and he is trying to tackle the Depression within his own state. And this kind of sets the stage for the 1932 presidential election, in which FDR challenges Hoover for the presidency. Now, FDR and Hoover are very different people. There's a great story that kind of illustrates the fact of the different types of people they were. The first story comes from Theodore Joslin. He was Hoover's secretary. He recounts how Hoover would invite banking executives into his office. So these banking people would come in, and Hoover would, quote, rattle off the number of banks in the country, list their liabilities and assets, describe the trend of fiscal affairs, and go into the liquidity or lack of it of individual institutions, all from memory. So Hoover can bring in a banking official and start just telling him all kinds of financial statistics about the American financial system. FDR, on the other hand, he would pull out a map and he would ask visitors to draw a line across the map of the United States, and then FDR would go county by county everywhere that line touched. and he would tell you the political story of that county, who the bigwigs in that county were, whether it was a Republican or Democrat county. So on the one hand, Hoover's an expert in finances. He knows things. FDR, on the other hand, is an expert in politics. And that's kind of the difference between their two governing styles. Now, when the time came in the summer of 1932, the Democrats nominated FDR in Chicago. FDR breaks precedent and he flies to Chicago to accept the nomination in person. This is something that nobody had ever done before. He wanted to prove to the nation that he was willing to take risks and take part in these big gestures, because that's kind of what America needed to do. Now, when he accepted the nomination at Chicago, FDR famously said, quote, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. So that little speech is where the term New Deal comes from. Now, what was FDR's view of government? We kind of need to know that. In an August 1931 message, he asked, what is the state? And this was his answer. It is the duly constituted representative of an organized society of human beings, created by them for their mutual protection and well-being. The state or the government is but the machinery through which mutual aid and protection is achieved. Our government is not the master, but the creature of the people. The duty of the state towards the citizen is the duty of the servant to its master. So basically, why should we ever want to limit the power of government? The government is the people. You know, we have self-government in this country, so why would the people ever want to do anything wrong? As a candidate in 1932, FDR gave a speech at Oglethorpe University, and he said this, quote, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. Take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. Now, in the same speech, he also discussed, quote, the gigantic waste in the American economy and its superfluous duplication of productive facilities. He said that, quote, our physical economic plant will not expand in the future at the same rate at which it has expanded in the past. This meant that we must think less about the producer and more about the consumer. And also in another 1932 speech, this was a pretty famous one, at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, FDR said this, a mere builder of more industrial plants, a creator of more railroad systems, an organizer of more corporations is as likely to be a danger as a help. The day of the great promoter or the financial titan to whom we granted anything if only he would build or develop is over. Our task now is the sober, less dramatic business of administering resources and plants already in hand, or seeking to reestablish foreign markets for our surplus production, of meeting the problem of underconsumption, of adjusting production to consumption, of distributing wealth and products more equitably, of adapting existing economic organizations to the service of the people. The day of enlightened administration has come. So basically, the day of Carnegie, Rockefeller, James Hill, those days are over. We don't need any new captains of industry. We just need an enlightened government that will kind of administer the wealth that's already out there. So this is kind of the setup to the election. FDR wins in a huge landslide. You can see the map here, how many states he won. The Democrats win in the House and the Senate. They get almost a 2-to-1 majority in the House. They have a 15-seat majority in the Senate. So 1932 is a huge landslide for the Democrats. Now, there is a time period between when FDR is elected and when he gets to become president. There's a 4-month span from November to March. In that 4 months, the banking system shut down completely. The global economy spiraled deeper and deeper into depression. The international scene became more dangerous, with Germany and Japan kind of being more aggressive. Some people likened the crisis to a war and suggested that a dictator was needed. What does a democracy do in a war? Quoted Al Smith. It becomes a tyrant, a despot, a real monarch. In the World War, we took our Constitution, wrapped it up, and laid it on the shelf and left it there until the war was over. The governor of Kansas said that, quote, even the iron hand of a national dictator is in preference to a paralytic stroke. So a lot of Americans think that maybe we need a president kind of acting like a dictator. Hoover and FDR have a couple meetings in 1932 and then one in 1933 after the election. Hoover kind of hopes that FDR will issue some statements to calm the financial people in the country. He wants some comments on what FDR will do with the banking system. But FDR kind of keeps his mouth shut. He doesn't want to fix anything before the country lets him become president. Now, after the election, FDR puts together a group of advisors. These people get called FDR's Brain Trust. They're just basically college professors that kind of come up with these ideas to help fix the Great Depression. Some of them include Raymond Moley. He's kind of the head brain truster. Rexford Tugwell, Adolph Burley Jr., Felix Frankfurter, Samuel I. Rosenman, Basil Doc O'Connor, Hugh Johnson. There's others. You don't need to know all these people. But they supported an underconsumption explanation of the Great Depression. You know, the productivity of the 1920s was not fairly distributed. This caused workers' buying power to fall behind the ability to consume all the products of industry. You know, this leads to inventories piling up and plants closing or workers being laid off. There were also, these people were believers in the mature economy or stagnationist thesis. Basically, they thought the era of economic expansion had ended. Technological boundaries had been reached. No more great innovations such as the automobile were on the horizon. The main problem was overproduction. So on one hand, you got to wonder how smart these college professors really are. You know, if they think that there's no more technological innovations going to happen. So, you know, they didn't think very hard about the future, about airplanes or computers or, you know, things later on like the iPhone. They believe that this is the best it's ever going to get. So not very visionary people. In February 1933, 1 month before the inauguration, another more intense banking panic happens. Tens of thousands of people made bank runs, taking their money home to hide under the mattress or in a tin can. Governmental decrees closed every bank in 32 states. Almost all the banks in 6 other states were closed. In the remaining states where banks were open, there were limits on how much of your money you could withdraw. In Texas, you could only take out $10 a day out of your bank. And I got a great clip here from just an amazing movie, It's a Wonderful Life. This clip shows what a bank run was like, so I want you to watch this clip.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George. I've never really seen one, but that's got all the earmarks of being a run.
Now, just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared. I have some news for you, folks. I was just talking to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But, George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Well, no, Charlie, I didn't even ask him. We don't need Potter over here.
And I'll take mine now.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
Okay, Tom. All right. Here you are. You sign this. You get your money in 60 days.
60 days?
Well, now, that's what you agreed to when you bought your shares.
Tom, did you get your money?
No.
Well, I did. Old man Potter will pay 50 cents on the dollar for every share you've got.
50 cents on the dollar?
Yes, cash.
Well, what do you say?
No, Tom, you have to stick to your original agreement. Now, give us 60 days on this
Okay,
thing.
Randall.
Are you going to Potter's?
Better to get half than nothing.
That's what I need.
Randall, now, Randall, wait a minute. Now, wait. Now, listen. Now, listen to me. I beg of you not to do this thing. If Potter gets a hold of this building and alone, there'll never be another decent house built in this town. He's already got charge of the bank, he's got the bus line, he's got the department stores, and now he's after us. Why? Well, it's very simple. Because we're cutting in on his business, that's why. And because he wants to keep you living in his slums and paying the kind of rent he decides. Joe, you had one of those Potter houses, didn't you? Well, have you forgotten? Have you forgotten what he charged you for that broken-down shack? Here, Ed, you remember last year when things weren't going so well and you couldn't make your payments? Well, you didn't lose your house, did you? You think Potter would have let you keep it? Can't you understand what's happening here? Don't you see what's happening? Potter isn't selling, Potter's buying. And why? Because we're panicky and he's not, that's why. He's picking up some bargain. Now, we can get through this thing all right. We've got to stick together, though. We've got to have faith in each other.
But my husband hasn't worked in over a year, and I need money.
How am I going to live until the bank opens?
I got doctor bills to pay. I need cash.
I can't keep my kids on faith. I've got to have...
How much do you need?
Hey! I got $2,000. Here's $2,000. This will tide us over to the bank reopens. All right, Tom, how much do you need?
$242.
No, Tom, just enough to tide you over until the bank reopens.
I'll take $242.
There you are.
That'll close my account.
Your account's still here. That's a loan. Okay. All right, Ed.
Well, I got $300 here, George.
All right, now, Ed, what'll it take until the bank opens? What do you need?
Well, I suppose $20.
$20. Now you're talking. Thanks, Ed. That's fine. All right, now, Miss Thompson, how much do you want?
But it's your own money,
Now,
George.
never mind about that. How much do you want now?
I can get along with 20, all right.
$20, fine.
And I'll sign the
There you are.
paper.
You don't have to sign anything. I know you. You pay when you can. That's okay. All right, Miss Davis.
Could I have $17.50?
That's your heart. Of course you can have it. You got 50 cents. There we go. 7.
We're gonna make it, George.
6.
They'll never close us up today.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bingo! We made it. Close the door, Eustace. We made it. Look, we're still in business. We still got $2 left. Well, look, let's have some of that. Let's celebrate.
Okay, so Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1933, FDR started by going to church at St. John's Episcopal. FDR told his political advisor, Jim Farley, quote, "I think a thought to God is the right way to start off my administration. A proper attitude towards religion and belief in God will in the end be the salvation of all peoples. For ourselves, it will be the means of bringing us out of the depths of despair into which so many have apparently fallen." He let Reverend Endicott Peabody lead the service. The reverends asked God, quote, "Thy favor to behold and bless thy servant Franklin, chosen to be President of the United States." Reverend Peabody was his old kind of headmaster at Groton Prep School. FDR sang hymns. When the service was over, FDR remained on his knees in silent prayer. So he kind of starts his administration off that way. Now, I want you to watch this clip from FDR's inaugural address. It just kind of gives you a feel for what the atmosphere was like.
This is a day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day, my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. We face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no market for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. And yet we are stricken by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered, we have still much to be thankful for. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep, practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truth. This nation is asking for action, and action now. There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money. And there must be provision for an adequate but sound currency. These, my friends, are the lines of attack I shall presently urge upon a new Congress in special session detailed measures for their fulfillment, and I shall seek the immediate assistance of the 48 states. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask the...
Okay, so this brings us to FDR's moment, the New Deal, his program for tackling the Great Depression. Historians categorize the New Deal into two separate parts, the first and second New Deal. The first New Deal includes the first 100 days, and it basically covers 1933 and 1934, although some historians say it bleeds over into 1935. The second New Deal starts in 1935 and it lasts until 1938. And then in 1938, the New Deal comes to an end. Congress starts to oppose reform, and FDR starts to focus more on World War II that's about to break out in Europe. So the first New Deal focuses on relief, recovery, and reform, but it's more focused on saving Americans' homes, their savings, and the way of life of the American people, the American people's way of government. It's more of an emergency, like let's just stop the bleeding. The second New Deal focuses more on reform. How can we totally change American government and society so that we can institute reforms we want so this doesn't happen again? So as we go through this first 100 days, feel free to pull out your guided notes and jot down a little bit about each of these laws. We're going to look at 15 major laws. We can't discuss them all in detail, but there's 15 major pieces of legislation passed in the first 100 days. FDR calls a special session of Congress on March 5th. They're supposed to meet March 9th, and then they meet until June 16th. FDR and Congress focus on four main areas: the banking failures, agriculture, business and industry, and then unemployment. Now, the first law that gets passed is the Emergency Banking Act. FDR deals with the banking crisis. Basically what he does is he calls for a bank holiday. He closes the banks down, and then he's going to reopen them, and hopefully that will stabilize the banking system. people started to write this law before Congress met. Raymond Moley commented regarding the bill, "We had forgotten to be Republicans or Democrats. We were just a bunch of men trying to save the banking system." So you have a bunch of Hoover people and a bunch of FDR people getting together to write this law that will hopefully save the banking system. William Wooden, he was FDR's Treasury Secretary. He was sitting at a desk with Ogden Mills, Hoover's Treasury Secretary, and then when the time came for FDR to become president, they just turned around and sat on opposite sides of the desk, and they keep working on the bill just as before. The Emergency Banking Act gets passed March 9th. There's 38 minutes of debate in the House. They didn't even have the bill. They held up a newspaper and kind of used that as the mock bill. The most important thing the Emergency Banking Act did was it authorized the reopening of banks under strict government supervision. Now, FDR holds his first fireside chat on Sunday, March 12th. The banks are supposed to reopen the next day, Monday, March 13th. So FDR wants to assure the American people that when you go back to the banks on Monday, put your money in, the banks will be safe, and there'll be no more bank collapses. So I want you to listen to this fireside chat and just kind of see how FDR talks to the American people.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets of a bank and convert them into cash except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all of the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday. And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, showed by this action a devotion to public welfare and a realization of the emergency and the necessity for speed that it is difficult to match in all our history. The third stage has been the series of regulations permitting the banks to continue their functions to take care of the distribution of food and household necessities and the payment of payroll. This bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. Remember that no sound bank is a dollar worse off than it was when it closed its doors last week. Neither is any bank which may turn out not to be in a position for immediate opening. The new law allows the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets, and thus the banks that reopen will be able to meet every legitimate call. The new currency is being sent out by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in large volume to every part of the country. It is sound currency because it is backed by actual good assets.
Okay, some more laws get passed. The Economy Act cuts the federal budget by a lot of different measures. The Beer, Wine Revenue Act anticipates the end of Prohibition. In February 1933, right before FDR becomes president, the lame duck Congress repealed Prohibition. Now it would just take the necessary 3/4 of the states to do that, to ratify the 20th Amendment. This Beer, Wine Revenue Act was just a revenue-generating measure. The Civilian Conservation Corps gets passed. It was modeled off of a program that FDR had implemented while he was governor of New York. Over its lifetime, it was one of the most popular New Deal programs. It employed over 3 million young men. Harry Hopkins oversaw the CCC. It put young men to work on forestry, flood control, and beautification projects. They built fire breaks and lookouts in national forests. They built bridges, campgrounds, trails, and museums and national parks. They planted trees. They built picnic areas and other facilities. It's just a quick, let's get people to work measure. The CCC operated like an army camp. Young, unemployed men ages 18 to 25, they could enlist for 6-month terms. They could renew 3 times, so you could be a CCC worker for 2 years. They were paid $30 a month, but they had to send 25 of that home to their family. They received 5 days of training at an army camp. They wore army uniforms. They drove around in army trucks. They slept in military-style open barracks. They were commanded by a mix of military officers and CCC officers. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, they were created to basically coordinate and increase direct federal unemployment assistance to the states. FERA would provide both matching and direct grants to states for relief work. They had some 150,000 administrative jobs. Sometimes this leads to corruption. But you can imagine this agency has that many jobs just administering it, so it's a pretty big deal. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed. This was an attempt to address the farm depression that the nation had been experiencing in the 1920s. This was one of the most controversial New Deal programs. Basically, FDR and his brain trust saw overproduction as the main problem facing farmers. So the AAA, that's what it's called for domestic allotments. Farmers would be paid directly by the government not to produce certain crops. These payments would be financed by a new tax on agricultural processors, canners, millers, packers, commodity brokers. Farmers were paid to burn their crops or plow under their fields or kill their animals. 1 million cotton farmers were paid $100 million to plow under 10 million acres of cotton. Hog farmers were paid to kill 6 million piglets. Over 12,000 acres of tobacco was plowed under. Little AAAs were created in many states. During the 1930s, some 21 states adopted milk control laws. So here's kind of an illustration of how the AAA worked. A wheat farmer was paid by the government not to plant wheat, and the flour companies that turned his wheat into bread were taxed to fund the government payment to the farmer. A hog farmer was paid by the government to kill some of his pigs, and the meat companies that turned the hogs into bacon, they were taxed to pay the pig farmer. A cotton farmer was paid by the government not to plant cotton or to plow up his cotton, and the textile companies that made clothing out of that cotton, they had to pay the tax that paid the cotton farmer. So basically, in all of these instances, the flour companies, the meat companies, the textile companies, they raised their prices because of this tax. So the AAA actually made food and clothing more expensive during the Great Depression. So this was one of the criticisms of FDR. When Americans were hungry and lacked adequate clothing, he worked to make those things cost more. There's a great passage from the historian journalist John T. Flynn. He was a big critic of FDR. He wrote at the time, he said this, quote, "We had men burning oats when we were importing oats from abroad on a huge scale, killing pigs while increasing our imports of lard, cutting corn production and importing some 30 million bushels of corn from abroad. And while Wallace," that's the secretary of the AAA, "and while Wallace was paying out hundreds of millions to kill millions of hogs, not millions, thousands, burn oats, plow under cotton, the Department of Agriculture issued a bulletin telling the nation that the great problem of our time was our failure to produce enough food to provide the people with a mere subsistence of diet. The department made up 4 sample diets. There was a liberal diet, a moderate diet, a minimum diet, and finally an emergency diet below the minimum. And the figures showed that we did not produce enough food for our population to have a minimum diet, a mere subsistence." So basically the government is putting out these dietary guidelines, but then also telling farmers to kill their food or cut it down. For almost the first time in American history, America became a major food importing nation. In 1933, the U.S. was plowing under 10 million acres of cotton and killing 6 million piglets. In 1935, the U.S. was importing 36 million bales of cotton and 2 million pounds of ham and bacon. About 100,000 men from farming communities were hired to help enforce and determine the correct acreage for each farmer that they would pull out of production. Often what happens was the farmers picked the worst land not to plant on, and oftentimes he didn't even originally plant on that land. So like a wheat farmer might remove 40 out of 200 acres for cultivation, but he would pick the worst 40 acres he had. Sometimes he would use his government check to buy fertilizer to plant on that remaining 160 acres. So actually the government would give him money to produce less, and he would buy fertilizer and it would help him produce more. H.V. Kaltenborn was a national radio commentator, and he described how, quote, "The amount of regulatory machinery essential to administer the AAA was a fearsome thing to behold for anyone who believed in the American farmer as master of his own domain. Thousands of inspectors had to be sent into the fields. Thousands of accountants had to keep track of what each inspector reported about, what each farmer was growing, and what benefits every grower or non-grower was entitled to receive. As soon as the AAA helped one group of farmers, other groups were affected and called for similar benefits and protective regulations. If one particular crop was controlled, the farmer would plant excessively in other crops. If acreage was controlled, he would use only his best acres. That produced a new surplus, which also had to be controlled. Farmers were paid millions of dollars not to produce crops, while President Roosevelt was telling us that 1/3 of our people were ill-fed. For every problem that was solved, 2 or 3 new problems was created. FDR also passed the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act to help farmers not lose their farms. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a dream held by progressives for decades. This gets passed or implemented by FDR. The TVA would be a public corporation that would generate and distribute hydroelectric power for the Tennessee River Valley. It would build dams for flood control, produce fertilizers, combat soil erosion and deforestation. Its goal was to bring jobs, investments, and the promise of prosperity to the 7 states of the Tennessee River Valley. FDR passed the Truth and Securities Act, the Homeowners Loan Act, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. These all tried to help people stay in their homes, have the stock market be more regulated, make banking more transparent and safe. The Glass-Steagall Banking Act included the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This guaranteed banking deposits of up to $2,500. Which in 1933, that was 95% of the individual accounts in the United States. So if you put in $2,500, you're guaranteed by the government that even if your bank fails, you'll get your $2,500 back. Now, the last thing passed by the 100 Days Congress, the first 100 days, is also the most controversial. It's called the National Industrial Recovery Act. FDR considered this the most important part of the New Deal. History will probably record the National Industrial Recovery Act as the most important and far-reaching legislation ever enacted by the American Congress. One historian called it the flagship of the New Deal. Hugh Johnson, the guy that ran the NRA, that's part of the act, he said that it was the greatest social advance since the days of Jesus Christ. The NIRA was the New Deal's attempt to promote industrial recovery. There were three components of the law. Section 7A provided for federal regulation of maximum hours and minimum wages in various industries. It also gave industrial workers the right to organize and bargain collectively through the representatives of their choice, so it allows unionization. It created the National Recovery Administration, that's the NRA. The NRA oversaw production of government-sanctioned cartels. Basically, whole industries would agree to set prices and wages and then stick to that. It also created the Public Works Administration. The PWA sought to undertake an ambitious public construction program. The construction program was directed by Secretary of the Interior Harold L. Ickes. They built roads, schools, dams, warships, and submarines. This PWA tended to employ skilled workers like architects, engineers, and construction workers. The NIRA had its origins in the bureaucracies of World War I and something called the Swope Plan. General Electric President Gerard Swope put together a plan whereby bureaucratic codes would be drafted by trade associations and would determine how much each company could produce and what prices would be. Cooperative planning would take the place of uncoordinated, unplanned, disorderly individualism of the free market. The NRA allowed American industrialists to get together and set something called codes of fair competition. There were NRA codes for everything. Artificial flowers, feathers, fabric, auto equipment, mattress covers, light sewing, breakfast furniture, retail drugs, retail farm equipment, retailed solid fuels, rock crushers, truckers, retail lumber, building materials, undergarments, and negligees, upholstery, decorative fabrics, shoulder pads, dog food. Basically anything in America could now have a code of fair competition set by the industry. In all, there were over 500 codes and 200 supplementary regulations. This affected 2.3 million employers and 16 million workers. Big companies can afford to send lawyers to Washington to set up these codes of fair competition, but little companies can't do this. The NRA actually supported monopolies and put many little guys out of business. FDR signed an executive order that created the National Recovery Review Board to look into issues of the NRA and monopolies. And one of the principal findings was that, quote, in virtually all the codes we have examined, one condition has persisted. The code has offered an opportunity for the more powerful interests to seize control of an industry or to augment and extend control they already obtain. So basically the NRA helped the big guy but hurt the little guy. The head of the NRA was Hugh Johnson. He drafted something called the President's Reemployment Agreement that pushed for a minimum wage of $12 to $15 a week and an hourly work week of 44 hours. He created this Blue Eagle insignia, and he came up with a slogan, "We do our part," to promote the NRA. He urged business leaders to sign a pledge to become members of the NRA and display the Blue Eagle in their store windows. He also urged consumers not to buy from businesses that did not display the Blue Eagle. Hugh Johnson pushed the Blue Eagle on radio and at rallies and parades. There was a huge parade that took place down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. It was seen by an estimated 2 million people. There was even a song promoting the Blue Eagle. Henry Ford refused to go along with the NRA and the Blue Eagle scheme. And when Hugh Johnson was asked by a reporter what would happen to people who did likewise, he said, quote, "They'll get a sock in the nose." So here you have this head of this agency threatening to punch people that don't support the NRA. I have a couple of clips of the NRA propaganda that I want you to watch.
You've got a president now. He gave the land a new deal. You hold the cards, now you deal. You and you and you and you put shoulders to the plow. He gave us what we asked for, now pay him back somehow. Step out in front, get back of the president, and give a man a job. He bore the brunt, now bear with the president, and give a man a job. If the old name of Roosevelt makes the old heart throb, you take this message straight from the president and give a man a job. You look like a banker who drives your car.
I drive it myself, have a cigar.
Keep your cigar and hire a chauffeur, and keep a man from becoming a loafer. You look like a grocer.
No, sir, my job's extermination.
You must give your assistants each a nice weekend vacation.
And I'll need more men to kill the rats.
We want you to hire a crowd. You'll do good work if you hang out this sign that means no rats allowed. What's the matter with you?
I'm a very sick woman.
Oh, a hypochondriac. You must get a doctor for pneumonia, a doctor for insomnia, one for osmosis and two for halitosis, one for anemia and one for eczema, neuritis, bronchitis, phlebitis, St. or any other kind of an itis that will delight us. You must get a doctor for every disease you got. In that way, he'll give you lots of enjoyment. And in that way, madam, you will help to end unemployment. Now listen to me, everybody. Step out in front. Get back at the president and give a man a job. You know he bore the brunt. You know that. I know it. So step out and give a man a job. You know who's in back of this NRA? No? Well, I'll tell you. And when I do, it'll give you heart a throb. You take this message straight from the president and get a man a job.
The poor boy has fallen asleep. He's been writing a song for the NRA.
There's nothing like a good song to inspire a nation.
Things are getting better every day.
Well, Abe, it looks as though we can stop worrying about our country. President Roosevelt has it headed right again.
All it needed was a plan of action and a man with the courage to put it through.
There isn't a person in America who won't profit by the National Recovery Administration. If every man, woman, and child will do his part.
You can always depend upon Americans.
Did I hear someone mention NRA? Oh, I didn't realize who you were. You see, I've just been writing a patriotic song. I must have fallen asleep.
Don't excuse yourself, my boy. We've been watching you. In fact, I've been watching everything that has happened in this country for over 157 years. I've seen it grow from 13 states to the greatest and strongest country in the world. And now, through the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, it is striving forward to finer and better things.
I know the NRA is a great thing for America, but you see, I'm just like thousands of others. I hardly know exactly how it operates. If you'd explain it to me, it might give me an idea for my song.
Just what do you want to know?
What is the idea behind the NRA? What'll it do?
It will end unemployment and restore the purchasing power of the American people, the thing this country has been trying to do for many years.
Oh, great. Tell me more about it, will you?
President Roosevelt has asked each employer to split up existing work to give more people jobs and see to it that every man has a living wage.
Yes, a man and every man's job. I live to see the freeing of the slaves. But this is a step toward the freeing of the slaves at the sweatshops, eliminating child labor, and giving the toilers a chance to enjoy the beauties of life.
What can I do to help it out?
You and 120 million other Americans can help by patronizing stores that display the Blue Eagle. Those stores are sharing to bring back prosperity.
I suppose everybody is compelled to sign the NRA code.
No, this is a gentleman's agreement. President Roosevelt is asking each to lend a helping hand for the common good.
Oh, I see. As soon as everybody goes back to work, they have more money to spend, and that would increase business everywhere. Is that right?
That's it exactly. The more people buy, the more things the manufacturers will have to make, and the farmers will have to grow. And the road to better times will be open again.
The road to better times. Open again. Open. Why, that's it. That's an idea for my song. Listen, here it is. There's a new day in view, there is gold in the blue, there is hope in the hearts of men. All the world's on the way to a sunnier day, for the road is open again. There's a note of repair, there's a song in the air, it's the music of busy men. Every plow in the land meets a happier hand, 'cause the road is open again. There's an eagle blue in the White House too, on the shoulder of our president there, with a lusty call telling one and all, brother, do your share. There's a new day in view, there is gold in the blue, there is hope in the hearts of men. From the plain to the hill, from the farm to the mill, all the road is open again. Everybody sing it. There's a new day in view, there is gold in the blue, there is hope in the hearts of men. All the world's on the way to a sunnier day, 'cause the road is open again. There's a note of repair, there's a song in the air, it's the music of busy men. Every plow in the land meets a happier man, 'cause the road is open again. There's eagles blue
There were some 1,400 NRA compliance enforcers at 54 branch locations, so they had people that it's their job to go out and enforce these codes on businesses. They were empowered to recommend fines of up to $500 and 6 months in jail for every violation of an NRA code. In December 1933, the NRA launched its biggest crackdown by summoning 150 dry cleaners to Washington for discounting. So they charged less than they were supposed to for their services, and that was breaking the law. In April 1934, Jacob Majd, he's a 49-year-old immigrant. He was jailed for 3 months and fined because he charged 34 cents to press a suit rather than the 40 cents that the NRA said you had to charge. F.H. Mills Jr., he was the president of Master Tire and Service Incorporated in Ohio. He refused to sign the NRA code and sell at higher prices. An NRA official came to him and threatened to, quote, put his heel upon the neck of our little company and twist it with all the force at his command. So he had these NRA enforcers going out and threatening businesses. Eventually, the NIRA was struck down as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court struck it down in May of 1935. This was the Schechter v. United States case. The Schechter brothers sold kosher chickens in Brooklyn. The government charged these brothers with 3 things, basically paying wages below the code minimum, selling sick chickens, and allowing consumers to select the chickens of their choice instead of selecting a chicken from the coop at random. Joseph Heller, the attorney representing the Schechter brothers, he explained that under the NRA code, it was, quote, the customer is not permitted to select the ones that he wants, meaning the chickens. He must put his hand in the coop, and when he buys from the slaughterhouse, take the first chicken that comes to hand. The Supreme Court members laughed when they heard this. Justice George Sutherland jokingly says, well, suppose, however, that all the chickens just go over to one side of the coop and you can't grab one. This is a 9-0 unanimous decision. After the Supreme Court issues this verdict, FDR criticized the Supreme Court as taking America, quote, back to a horse and buggy interpretation of the Constitution, but others are very happy with this case. Senator Bora says, the Constitution has been reestablished. Journalist Frank Kent said of the NRA, it was impulsively adopted without mature consideration. It was fastened on the people by the most blatant ballyhoo ever promoted by government, and it ends in a horrible mess. Raymond Moley, the head of FDR's Brain Trust, he later admitted that the NRA and the Blue Eagle was a mistake. He said, quote, planning an economy in normal times is possible only through the discipline of a police state. Economic planning on a national scale in a politically free society involves contradictions that cannot be resolved in practice. The bones of the Blue Eagle should be a grim reminder of this reality. Now I want to read you a summary of the first 100 days. This comes from David Kennedy's Freedom from Fear. I think it does a good job summing it up. Kennedy writes, quote, the New Deal had decisively halted the banking panic. It had invented wholly new institutions to restructure vast tracts of the nation's economy, from banking to agriculture to industry to labor relations. It had authorized the biggest public works program in American history. It had earmarked billions of dollars for federal relief to the unemployed. It had designated the Great Tennessee Watershed as the site of an unprecedented experiment in comprehensive planned regional development. No less important, the spirit of the country, so discouraged by 4 years of economic devastation, had been infused with Roosevelt's own contagious optimism and hope. Now, despite all these programs, the Great Depression persisted. In the fall of 1933, Lorena Hickok, she was a journalist working for Harry Hopkins. She set out on a fact-finding mission across the United States. Harry Hopkins told her, quote, what I want you to do is to go out around the country and look this thing over. I don't want statistics from you. I don't want the social worker angle. I just want your own reaction as an ordinary citizen. Go talk with the preachers and teachers, businessmen, workers, farmers. Go talk with the unemployed, those who are on relief and those who aren't. Lorena Hickok saw the poverty of America during the Depression. You can read about her trip in the book 1/3 of a Nation. Lorena Hickok reports on the Great Depression. Her report includes some of the most tragic stories of the 1930s, stories of families living in tents for years, children who have never tasted milk before. At one stop in Kentucky, she was told that 5 babies had died of starvation in the last 10 days. Lorena said that she saw people, quote, struggle in competition for less to eat than my dog gets at home. One writer, Erskine Caldwell, he went on a visit to Georgia, and he commented that he saw 3 families jammed into 2 rooms. A 6-year-old child was on the floor licking the wrappings of a meat package, while next to him 2 babies less than a year old were nursing a dog. Coal miners had to eat something called bulldog gravy. It was a food made of flour, water, and lard. Farmers lived off something called Russian thistle soup. This was soup made from tumbleweeds. So the Great Depression is still raging throughout America. One of the most difficult things for many individuals and families was to accept government relief. Many Americans believed in good times, during the Roaring '20s, that success was up to the individual. So in bad times, it was hard for them to not think that failure was also due to the individual. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration handed out relief money to Americans, but the process by which relief was handed out convinced many government officials that direct relief needed to be ended and replaced with work relief. They just believed that direct relief destroyed the dignity of the individual, and you can kind of tell why. To get federal relief, a person would have to go to something called an intake facility. This was just basically a dreary room. Here they would be screened for eligibility by a government official. Lorena Hickok wrote in her report that, quote, intake is about the nearest thing to hell that I know anything about. The smell alone, I'd recognize it anywhere. And take that on top of the psychological effect of having to be there at all. God, if I was applying for relief, one look at the average intake room would send me to the river. After making one's way through the intake facility, next came the means test. This entailed a detailed examination of the applicant's private life. There would be a home visit from a social worker, questions about one's income, one's savings, debt, relatives, health, diet, etc. would be asked. As I said before, many within the government realized how demoralizing direct relief was, so they start to instead turn to work relief to kind of solve the Great Depression and help people out. Now, for those that can work, they want work relief, but there's still direct relief for people that can't work even if there are jobs available. Now, despite all these programs, or in spite of all these programs, FDR still gets a lot of criticism. He gets criticism from the left, and he gets criticism from the right. He started to face stiff criticism from the right, which argued that the New Deal did too much, giving government too much power and taking away the liberty of individuals. He got criticism from the left, which argued that the New Deal did not go far enough, and that FDR was actually saving capitalism, not remaking American society. There's many different strands of criticism aimed at FDR from the left. There's progressives, both Republicans and Democrats, who want to remake American society. There's populist agitators in the farming Midwest and South. There's the Socialist Party. There's the Communist Party of the United States, who really want to change American society, and they see the Great Depression as a chance to do that. One of the first people to kind of challenge FDR from the left was the muckraker Upton Sinclair. In 1933, he writes a pamphlet called I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty, a true story of the future. Basically, it tells the story of his future campaign for governor of California and the program that he implements to end the Great Depression. It's called EPIC, End Poverty in California. Lewis calls for the government to seize idle land and factories and turn them over to the farmers and workers of the state. This would usher in something called the Cooperative Commonwealth. It would drive capitalism from America. Now, he does win the primary for the Democrat Party in August of 1934, but FDR refuses to endorse him. FDR does want to change American society. He does want to kind of attack business and capital, but he doesn't want to destroy capitalism and implement communism. So FDR refuses to endorse Upton Sinclair. He gets crushed in the fall election and defeated. After the election, he wrote a book called I, Candidate for Governor and How I Got Licked, so kind of poking fun at himself. But the most famous attack against FDR from the left comes from three different men, one a doctor, one a priest, and one a politician. That kind of sounds like the setup to a joke. A doctor, a priest, and a politician. The doctor is Francis Townsend, the priest is Charles Coughlin, and the politician is Huey Long. Okay, so Francis Townsend, we'll look at him first. He was a doctor in California. In September 1933, he writes a letter to a local newspaper. He wrote, quote, "It is just as necessary to make some disposal of our surplus workers as it is to dispose of our surplus wheat or corn." This becomes known as the Townsend Plan, or his letter, what he kind of initiates, becomes known as the Townsend Plan. He calls for monthly payments of $200 to people over the age of 60, on the condition that those receiving money retire from employment and spend that $200 within the month. So the benefits would be, number one, direct aid to the elderly. Secondly, the shrinking of the labor pool and therefore the raising of wages. And third, recovery through the circulation of all those monthly checks. The plan becomes very popular. Townsend clubs appear all over the nation. People circulate petition demanding that Townsend's idea becomes law. In January 1934, Townsend incorporates a movement into something called the Old Age Revolving Pension Program. He establishes a national newspaper called the Townsend National Weekly in 1935. Eventually, there grew to be over 5,000 Townsend clubs throughout the nation, containing somewhere around 2 million members. It's estimated that 25 million Americans signed petitions to make his plan become law. I got a little video clip here of him you can watch.
The March of Time. In San Francisco, the local chapter of an amazing American movement holds its weekly meeting. These elderly people are active believers in the so-called Townsend Plan, which was considered dead when Congress adjourned last August, but which today is very much alive.
Word has just come to us from the state of Michigan that in a congressional election there, the candidate endorsed by Dr. Townsend and pledged to the Townsend Plan won out in the Republican primary.
May I ask a question? Do my wife and I both get the pension?
Yes, husband and wife will each receive $200 a month.
I'm over 70. How long will I have to wait to get the pension?
If we all continue to do our part, we should be able to elect the next Congress of the United States, and the Townsend Plan should follow soon after that.
Francis Everett Townsend, a country doctor long experienced in human suffering, sat up nights trying to find a simple cure for the nation's economic depression. At last, conceiving a formula, he took it to his shrewd friend, Earl Clement.
Well, Earl, now that you've thought it over and studied my figures, what do you think?
Doctor, I've searched the library and have proven the plan economically sound. It's a great idea, and we can put it over. We'll call it the Townsend Plan. What do you say?
Fine.
For 2 years, the Townsend Plan is obscured by other schemes to save the nation. Upton Sinclair and his epic plan are driven from public life by the voters of California. Huey Long and his plan, the Share the Wealth movement, come to a sudden end in Louisiana. The radio priest, Father Charles Edward Coughlin, passes his peak. The country's war veterans, urging cash payment of their $2 billion bonus as a recovery measure, are twice rebuffed in 2 years for the sake of national economy. The advent of 1936 finds Dr. Francis Everett Townsend of Long Beach, California, no longer an obscure name on the public payroll, but a national figure, moving eastward across the land with his wife, attracting big crowds everywhere. In Washington, newly established Townsend headquarters are an anthill of activity. Out go letters, literature, in come applications for charters, money for dues and subscriptions. Townsend clubs spring up in thousands of American communities as eager oldsters sign up to help save their country and to obtain steady incomes for themselves. Dr. Townsend is introduced to Eastern audiences by his Eastern organizer, one Clinton Wonder, old-time preacher and promoter.
Dr. Wonder, do you really think this thing will work?
My friend, we believe that God is on our side, and with God, all things are possible. And don't forget, there are 18 million voters in this country past the age of 55, and they can elect any president of the United States they want to.
Organizer Wonder's boast does not seem idle, as pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters tinkle into the campaign coffers at Dr. Townsend's meetings.
Social Security plan of the administration is wholly unfair, inadequate, and unjust. But the Townsend plan, through its great increase of buying power, will immediately restore prosperity.
How do we stand on Roosevelt's election next year?
How do we stand? I'll tell you how I stand, but I'm going to lie down on it. My friends, we cannot, we dare not fail. Our plan is the sole and only hope of a confused and distracted nation. We have become an avalanche of political power that no derision, no ridicule, no conspiracy of silence can stem.
When will these good people, millions like them, realize that they're being duped? The idea of involving one-half the national income annually in a pension scheme is wild.
Time marches on.
Now, the priest that attacked FDR was Father Charles Coughlin. He was a Catholic priest who lived in a suburb outside Detroit. He had been born in Canada, but then he comes to America. He used the radio to attract followers, and his nickname was the Radio Priest. He had a great voice for radio. His first address came in 1926. He focuses on religious issues, but then he starts to talk politics in the 1930s. Tens of millions of Americans listened to him. He was so popular that he had to have a staff of over 100 people just handle the mail that was sent to him. At first, he supported FDR in the New Deal. When he learned about FDR's nomination in 1932, he sent him a telegram saying, "I am with you to the end. Say the word and I will follow." Coughlin later said that the New Deal is Christ's deal. He said the country had a choice between Roosevelt or ruin. So Coughlin is a big supporter of FDR. But eventually, Coughlin turns against the New Deal because it doesn't go far enough in his view. In November 1934, he launches a new political party called the National Union for Social Justice. He had a 16 principles platformed. Some of the things he calls for is monetary reform, the nationalization of key industries, protections for labor. He turns against FDR. He says that FDR had out-Hoovered Hoover, so he just sees FDR as someone that's saving capitalism. Coughlin did have a lot of power. In January 1935, FDR attempts to get a treaty through the Senate that would kind of affiliate the United States with the World Court at The Hague. Coughlin rallies his supporters against the treaty. At one point, hundreds of thousands of telegrams opposing the treaty are wheelbarrowed into the Senate office building, and all the senators see that, hey, most Americans oppose this treaty. So the treaty gets killed because Coughlin tells his listeners on the radio, "I need you to write or telegram your senator, oppose this treaty." I got a little video here you can watch of Father Charles Coughlin kind of talking. You can see how he behaves and acts.
The Depression still waxed strong as the powers of deflation reached out to confiscate homes, to capture farms, and to keep that ever-marching army of jobless upon our streets, wondering when God in his mercy would lift his hand. I dared you and challenged you to organize so that the people, if not the president, would drive the money changers from the temple, and you did it. They believe that the Federal Reserve Bank has the right to coin and regulate the value of money. They're not even Americans, these so-called Democrats and Republicans. You appreciate the fact, my dear friends, that among other things in the National Union for Social Justice, we are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself, and with that principle, I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it. There is no need of communizing all the factories and the fields and the forests and the mines under a new kind of God made of flesh and blood and clay and hatred. When men become so prideful that they believe their destiny is to rewrite the eternal law of God, it's time for their fellow citizens to rise up in their wrath and through the agency of ballots and not bullets to relegate them to the pages of the past.
Now, the most famous critic from the left against FDR is Huey Long. He was a Louisiana politician. He had been elected governor of Louisiana and later senator. When he's elected senator, he also holds on to his title as governor, so he was governor and senator at the same time. When he ran for governor, his slogan had been, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown." Long was a rough, abrasive man who didn't care what politicians or moneyed men thought about him. One time he said, "All I care about is what the boys at the forks of the creek think about me. He was so unpolished that at one time he met with Roosevelt, he called him Frank, and he refused to take off his hat. The only time he did take off his hat was to tap FDR on the knee to kind of make a point. Now, despite his background, he is a great speaker and a great politician. His friends called him the Kingfish. In 1934, he launched something called the Share Our Wealth Society. He would make every man a king by confiscating large fortunes and levying a huge progressive tax. The revenues from this would be redistributed to every American family in the form of something called a household estate. That would be a one-time gift of $5,000. After that, every household would receive $2,500 a year. He also promised shorter hours for laborers, more benefits for veterans, educational subsidies for young people, and pensions for the old. Basically, Huey Long just wants to promise everything to every different constituency in America. He also starts to use the radio to reach an audience. I got a quote I want to read to you. This kind of explains what he believes. Huey Long says, quote, "God invited us all to come and eat and drink all we wanted. He smiled on our land and we grew crops of plenty to eat and wear. He showed us in the earth the iron and other things to make everything we wanted. He unfolded us to the secrets of science so that our work might be easy. God called, 'Come to my feast.' But then Rockefeller, Morgan, and their crowd stepped up and took enough for 120 million people and left only enough for 5 million for all the other 125 million to eat. And so many millions must go hungry without those good things God gave us unless we can call on them to put some of it back." I've got a video here of Huey Long kind of basically giving this same speech again, but I want you to watch it. It's pretty interesting.
According to the tables which we have assembled, it is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the house. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it. If that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, "Come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume." And that's the program. We're not going to destroy the Gulf Refining Company. We're not going to destroy the Standard Oil Company. But we're going to say that the limit of any one man's stock ownership in the Standard Oil Company is from $3 to $5 million to that individual, and that the balance of the people of America own the balance of what the Standard Oil Company is worth. All right. Then we start from the bottom, that the 25 or more million American families shall have a homestead, a home, and the comforts of a home, including an automobile and a radio, the things it takes in that house to live on. We say to America, 125 million, none shall be too big
None shall be too poor. None shall work too much. None shall be idle. No luxurious mansions empty. None walking the streets. None impoverished. None in pestilence. None in want. But in the land blessed by the smile of the Creator, with everything to be consumed, to be eaten, to be worn, that America will become a land sharing the fruits of the land, not for the favored few, not to satisfy greed, but that all may live in a land in which the Lord has provided an abundance sufficient for the luxury and convenience of the people in general, I think.
Long record.
Now, FDR worries about Coughlin and Long. Many Democrats start to worry that these men might actually have more appeal than FDR and threaten him from his left. One internal estimate done by the Democrat Party found that Long could win 4 million votes in the 1936 election. They worried that Long and others wanted to steal the election from FDR by running on his left. This would get a Republican elected. Huey Long had no faith in the Republicans that they could fix the Depression. So basically, let's let the Republicans get elected in 1936 by splitting the Democrat vote. The country will fall apart, and then in 1940 I can run and I'll win. That was kind of Huey Long's plan. FDR also faced criticism from the right. I kind of told you earlier, people that thought the government was becoming too powerful, individual rights were being trampled on. Herbert Hoover writes a book called The Challenge to Liberty, and he kind of sounds the warning that the New Deal is taking away individual liberties. Something called the American Liberty League is founded in 1934. This is founded by former Democrats and some Republicans. They sought to teach respect for property rights and enterprise. David Kennedy writes that the birth of the Liberty League marked the beginning of organized, articulate opposition to the New Deal on the right. Business owners attack FDR as making it harder to open a business or to operate a business in America. Government intervention has not allowed the economy the necessary corrections to take itself and to end the Depression. So FDR is challenged from all over. Somebody asked FDR about the American Liberty League, and he says this. He says, quote, "When you define American principles, you want to go the whole hog. An organization that only advocates 2 or 3 out of the 10 commandments may be a perfectly good organization, but it would have certain shortcomings in having failed to advocate the other 7 or 8. So that's what FDR had to say, criticizing the American Liberty League. So these are the problems FDR is facing from his left and his right. Next time we'll look at FDR's second New Deal and how he wins re-election and kind of takes the country more down the road of reform.